I don't know if this counts as a cryptid encounter or not, but it was definitely something far beyond the normal scope of modern zoology, that's for sure. I was on a kayaking trip in eastern Virginia. My route was about 30 miles, but that didn't take as long as you'd think with how fast the water was moving. It was only a 2-day, 1-night trip. I parked my car at the end point of my route and had a friend shuttle me off upriver that morning. I'm a pretty experienced boater, but this was going to be my first overnight solo trip. And after what I ran into out there, it landlocked me for about 5 years. I wouldn't even go into a swimming pool. The area I was kayaking was fairly remote. It wasn't dangerous country by any means, but it wasn't easily accessible, even by foot. The forests around that area are thick, and the underbrush makes it difficult to hike unless you are on groomed trails, which there weren't many of. Funnily enough, the landscape would seem a prime location for a Bigfoot sighting, but that isn't the creature I saw. Most of my trip was going according to plan. I did get hung up on a fallen tree and took on some water before I was able to free my boat, but things like that happen, and I just dumped the water out when I stopped for lunch and went on my way. I kayaked a little longer the first day than I had planned. I made good time, but it was around sunset before I stopped to make camp. I remember seeing something moving under the water as I beached my boat and drug it up onto shore. It didn't make a splash, and I couldn't get a good view of what it was before it headed for the safety of deeper water. I knew for sure it wasn't a fish. We have a type of large aquatic salamander called a hellbender that is native to the area. They can get pretty big, about 5 pounds, but sightings are rare. If you are lucky enough to see one in the wild, it is a sign the river is doing well. They typically hang out in shallow water and hide around large rocks. They pose no threat at all to humans, so nothing to worry about there. After that, I didn't think too much about the creature and started setting up camp for the night and started my dinner. It was nearly dark by that point, but the moon was full and reflected off the river, casting a faint blue glow across the landscape. There was a slight breeze that night, and the only sound across the entire valley was the wind in the leaves. That was one of the reasons I loved spending my time in the outdoors. It was so nice to get away and enjoy the silence. I had done a lot of camping up to that point. I always stored my food away from camp and washed up before settling in for the night, making sure not to draw the attention of hungry wildlife. I'll admit, bears do make me nervous, but I never had any problems with them before. I stored my food in a dry sack and hung it in a tree about 100 yards away from my tent. I could see the tree from camp, but just barely. I watched the sun set below the water, and I thought I saw something moving along the surface. At first, I thought it must be a waterlogged branch or tree that had fallen into the water. It was getting dark, so I couldn't see it well. I stared at it, trying to focus my eyes. Suddenly, it moved again. It was like a giant snake, or, if I didn't know better, I'd say it was a sea serpent. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. They had to be. There were no sea serpents in the rivers of Virginia. I had a long day on the river, so with that thought, I got ready for bed. I drifted off to sleep without another thought of what was in the river, but the mystery would soon come knocking at my door. I was awoken in the night to the sound of something sniffing at my tent. I could hear the creature moving on the grass outside, but I couldn't hear footfalls. I thought the worst. I thought it was a bear. I stayed still and silent and prayed for the animal to move on. I didn't have any food in the tent, nothing at all that smelled, not even a chapstick. The creature stayed at my camp for about 10 minutes before it decided there was nothing worth its time. I heard it bump into my kayak as it left. I stayed still in my tent for another 15 minutes before venturing out with a flashlight. There was no sign of the creature when I emerged. I searched the ground for footprints, but I couldn't make out anything discernible. I breathed a sigh of relief when I realized I was alone, but then I looked to the tree with my food hang. There was something wrapped around the base of the tree, and it looked like it was starting to climb. It looked like a giant snake from that distance. I was dumbfounded. We have snakes native to the area, but nothing like that. I left my camp to try to get a view of the creature. I had to know what it was. It seemed preoccupied with reaching my food bag, so I figured I was safe as long as I didn't get too close. I kept my distance out of cowardice, but I moved in close enough to see that it wasn't a snake that was climbing the tree. It was a salamander. It looked like a hellbender, but about 10 times the size. It must have been 12, maybe 15 feet long, and the middle of the creature was more akin to that of a snake than of a salamander. It was literally as if a sea serpent had grown legs and could walk on land. That's the only way I can describe it. I know it seems impossible, but I know what I saw. Unfortunately for me, the creature managed to reach my food and have itself an easy meal that night. I watched the entire thing happen, but I dared not confront the animal. It ate until it was satisfied and then waddled down the embankment and disappeared beneath the water's surface. I can tell you one thing for certain, and it's that I was not at all thrilled about putting my boat back in the river that morning. The entire way back to my car, I was searching for signs of that thing. Luckily, I didn't see it again. My brain tells me that it must have been an unnaturally large hellbender. It's not unheard of for fish, salamanders, and turtles to grow to absurd sizes when food is plentiful and their habitat allows it. But then, how do I explain the creature's elongated body? Is this just something that happens when they grow to such a size? Or did I meet something else out there on the river? I've always been a bit of an adventurer, always had a thing for the outdoors ever since I was a kid. Even back then, when all the other girls were playing dress-up, I just loved wandering in the woods and pretending I was lost. I'm older now, but I had this crazy thing happen to me about 30 years ago when I was in my late 20s. So one summer back in the 90s, I decided to plan a trip to go hiking alone in Yosemite National Park. Once the day arrived, I was more than happy to be there, and I set out right away to wander off and find the most remote area I could to camp. It took hours to finally arrive, and once I got set up, I wandered off to check out the surrounding area. I'd been hiking for a few hours when I stumbled upon a trail I hadn't noticed before. It was a bit overgrown, but something about it piqued my curiosity. I decided to follow it, see where it led. The trail wasn't like the others. It was a bit more rugged, a bit wilder. I had to duck under branches and step over roots. After a while, I came to this little bridge, but the creek bed under it was dried up. I kept going beyond the bridge, and eventually, I came to a clearing with stones all around it in a circle. Right in the middle of the circle was a huge well. I'd seen wells before, but this one was different. It was old, and it had this eerie vibe to it. I found a rock and tossed it in, but I never heard it hit the bottom. I don't know if the well was dry or if the water was so deep down, I couldn't hear the rock splash. I started looking around for more rocks to throw in. I was looking around in the bushes at the edge of the clearing and found these huge stones embedded in the ground. Then I realized there was writing on them even though I couldn't understand it. It took me a minute to realize they were gravestones. I was in some sort of graveyard in the middle of the woods far away from anyone. I started getting chills when I realized that. Just then, I saw a dark shape standing just inside the woods facing me. I stood up very slowly and stared at this dark shape. It didn't move at all until some clouds moved away and the clearing became more lit up. Then the shape moved as it scooted out of sight and back into the shadows. It was the size of a human adult, and to me it looked like it was covered in black feathers. It turned its head toward me and seemed to look right through me with these freakish red eyes. Then it lifted up these big black wings and jumped with incredible force up into the tree behind it and sat there perching on a branch like some giant bird out of a nightmare. I wasn't that freaking stupid. I turned around and ran as fast as I could back the way I had come. I ran over the bridge and found the original path, and then I looked back and saw that thing standing there at the edge of the bridge, just standing there. It had somehow gotten out of the tree and followed me a bit without me hearing anything. I screamed and kept running, soon tripping over a tree root in the path. I ripped my pants and tore up my knee, but I just got up and kept running. I burst out of the trees and just kept on going for hours until I reached my car. From there, I drive straight to a ranger station to tell them what I saw. They tried to calm me down and said there was nothing like that in the woods and that I must have made a mistake. But that just made me more hysterical and determined to convince them. I decided to do some research. I started looking into the history of Yosemite, trying to find any mention of a graveyard or a well. I spent hours poring over old maps and documents. I even reached out to local historians and park rangers, but no one seemed to know anything about it. One day, I came across an old newspaper article. It was from the late 1800s, and it mentioned a small settlement that used to exist within the park. The article was vague, but it mentioned a well and a graveyard. My heart skipped a beat. Could this be the same place I had stumbled upon? I decided to go back to Yosemite, back to that trail. I was scared, but I needed answers. I needed to know if what I saw was real or if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I needed to prove to the rangers that I wasn't crazy. The trail was just as I remembered it, overgrown and rugged. I followed it, my heart pounding in my chest for the few hours it took to get there. A few times I even nearly talked myself out of continuing, but I kept moving along. When I reached the clearing, it was just as eerie as I remembered. The well, the gravestones, they were all there, but there was no sign of the creature. I spent the day exploring the area, taking pictures, making notes. I even dared to go down the stairs of the well, but I didn't find anything unusual. As the sun began to set, I decided to set up camp in the clearing. I know it sounds crazy, but I had to know if the creature would come back. I barely slept that night, every sound making me jump, but the creature didn't show up. As the sun rose, I packed up my things and headed back. Even though I didn't see the creature again, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had faced my fear, returned to the place that had haunted me. I still don't know what I saw that day, but I've come to accept that there are things in this world that we can't explain. And you know what? That's okay. It's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to believe in the unknown, because sometimes the unknown is what makes life interesting. I spent some time working for a ranger station in the East Yellowstone area. It was just a summer job for me that year, so I wasn't too involved with the land and wildlife management part of it. Most of the time, I worked behind the desk, handing out maps and giving camping advice to the people looking for quiet areas for dispersed camping. Once in a while, when we were short-staffed, I got to work out in the field with the rangers. I remember it well. It was a Monday morning when our lead ranger came into the station. He had gotten a call about an animal carcass near one of the hiking trails. Although not a popular trail, it was still our responsibility to maintain it. And with the local bear population, we had to act quickly to make sure no one went near the carcass. We have both grizzly and black bears out there, and both species are territorial over food. It's not uncommon to be attacked by a bear if you stumble upon its food source. One of our main jobs is to reduce conflict between humans and wildlife, so I closed up the office that morning and went with him to place barricades at the trailheads to keep people away until the carcass was gone. We loaded the side-by-side onto the trailer. The trail was rough in that area, not accessible by truck. Most mountain trails around here are. We closed the trail at the parking lot and posted notices, but my boss wanted to take a look at the carcass. He wanted to get an exact location of it, but I could tell there was something else going on, though he didn't say anything about it at the time. We must have taken the side-by-side at least 15 miles into the wilderness before we found what we were looking for. Neither of us saw the body from the trail, but the smell gave it away. It only took a moment to find it after that. I thought it was a black bear at first. The fur seemed to match, but when we got out of the vehicle, I could see that my assumption was wrong. I learned later that the people who made the call were so frightened on the phone that they wouldn't say what the animal was. They were backpackers and coming home from a 4-night trip and were so shaken that they hiked through the last night to get out of there as quickly as possible. The carcass looked fairly fresh. It had only been dead maybe a day or two. The local scavengers had not yet found it. I couldn't believe what I was looking at, and judging by the look on the ranger's face, neither could he. It was the body of a giant ape. It had to be over 6 feet tall, maybe even 7. Its entire body was covered in thick black hair. The only hairless parts of its body were its face, the palms of its hands, and the bottoms of its feet. The skin there was dark brown and had the texture of tanned leather. Its eyes and mouth were open. I could see a glimpse of its teeth. They looked like human teeth from the little I could see. Its eyes were starting to dry out, but I remember them vividly. They were so human-looking and yet unlike anything I had ever seen. I remember they were amber, not yellow, but golden, like if you've ever seen a wolf's eyes. But there was something undeniably human behind them, even though the creature was long dead. Normally, when we went to investigate a carcass along a trail, we would just record its location and check up on it in a week or two before reopening the trail to the public. But I knew we weren't just going to leave this thing here. We tried to move it towards the trail, but even with the 2 of us, we couldn't lift it, not to mention the overpowering smell that made it nearly impossible to breathe. We quickly abandoned that idea and tied a rope around its body and attached it to the side-by-side. We managed to pull the body out of the woods that way, but once we got it to the main trail, we were at a standstill. There was no way we could get the creature into the back of the side-by-side ourselves. We would have to go back to the station and get ramps and a winch. I don't know how much that beast weighed, but it had to be somewhere around 300 pounds at the bare minimum. We left the creature's body there for maybe 4 hours before we could get the equipment we needed to move it. We had maybe an hour of sunlight left, but we figured the winch would make quick work of it, and while we would likely be out on the trail after dark, we would be on our way back to the truck by then. However, when we got back to the place we left the body, it was gone. There were no other tire tracks at the location, and I can guarantee there was no way someone, or even a group of people, managed to carry the creature out of there. We searched the area for any signs of it, thinking maybe a large predator carried it off to eat later. Oftentimes, bears will cache their food for later, burying it or hiding it under leaves and branches. Luckily, bears don't make very elusive caches and are easily uncovered if you take a minute to look around. But we couldn't find anything. The ranger crouched down in the spot where we left the creature's body. I couldn't see anything on the ground, but he could. He looked around for a moment before telling me to get back to the side-by-side. Now, I asked what was wrong, but he said he didn't have time to explain. It was nearly dark at that point, and the headlights illuminated the forest ahead of us. I thought that I saw eyes looking back at us in the trees. There were several of them, maybe 3 or 4 sets, all golden yellow against the lights from the side-by-side. The ranger spun the vehicle around and drove out of there as quickly as the vehicle would go. The trail was way too rough to drive at the speed we were going. I was strapped in and hanging on to the handle, and I still felt like I was going to fall out of the thing. Neither of us said a word to each other the entire ride back. Later, when we were back at the station, he told me that there were tracks around the creature's body, tracks that weren't there when we left it the first time. He said the tracks were faint. The ground was hard, so they were difficult to see, but it looked like there were several of the creatures that came to carry their friend away. The footprints, he said, were just like those of bare human feet, only significantly larger. There were no handprints accompanying the footprints, so it was likely that these ape creatures were walking on 2 feet. The only thing I could think was that I had just seen irrefutable evidence of a Bigfoot, and now suddenly it was gone. It's been years since I worked for the station, but I am still kicking myself that I didn't grab a sample of the creature's hair or something when I had the chance. I remember touching it when we tried to move the body, and it was unexpectedly soft. Softer than a bear's fur. Sometimes when I think back to that day, it feels like some sort of dream. Whatever these creatures actually are, they go to great lengths to conceal their existence. It was the winter of 1983, and my wife, and I had just moved to a small community in western Ohio called West Liberty, about an hour or so west of Columbus. I remember the day well. It was about 6 p.m. on a cold, dark winter day when we decided to go for a brisk walk down by the Mad River that ran through town. We were both in our late 20s at the time and very much into nature, so we enjoyed walking along the riverbank as well as along the trails near town. This day we walked for probably a mile or more until we got to an area where there were no houses or roads nearby. It was completely surrounded by woods with only the river flowing past us on one side. There is also an old railroad track bed that runs parallel to the river too, maybe 50 yards away from it, that's now used as a walking trail called the Simon Kenton Trail. Anyway, as we stood there looking out over the river, I noticed a large figure moving through the woods maybe 100 yards or so to our right. It was too far away for me to make out any specific details, but it appeared to be larger than a man, but it was walking upright on 2 legs, which is what made me think human. As I watched it move through the trees, it seemed to disappear into what looked like a small opening in the brush where an offshoot, or maybe old railroad tracks, ran through. I pointed it out to my wife, too, and said that I thought perhaps someone had lost their dog. She agreed that it was probably just someone's lost dog. But the thing was, all I could think was that no dog would walk upright like that, or be that big. But it was the best conclusion I could come up with that made any sense. We decided this was all just too weird and started to head back home as it was getting late anyway, and was also starting to get pretty dark due to it being winter time. So we started walking back towards town when all of a sudden we heard these crazy banging noises, and quickly realized that the sound was coming from the direction we had seen the thing go into the woods. There were no houses around for that kind of noise to be coming from, so we both looked at each other kind of funny and just walked quicker. As we got closer to where I thought whatever it was disappeared, I paid close attention to that small opening in the brush. It was about 8 feet wide. The thing is, though, these tracks hadn't been used in years, and they were overgrown with weeds and had grass all through them, so you couldn't really see them unless you knew exactly where they were. They also crossed under an old bridge that went over the river, which meant that this opening would lead us right underneath that bridge. I told my wife then that I thought perhaps whatever made those noises may have been down in that track bed under that old bridge, because there was nowhere else for anything to go except maybe up into those trees where we had first seen movement earlier. We stood there looking at each other, not really sure what to do, when all of a sudden we heard the same noise again coming from under the bridge. This time it was louder and closer, sounding like whatever it was really wanted to let us know it was there. At least that's the way we interpreted it. Well, we got the message and immediately continued on and didn't follow the tracks to the bridge. I mean, obviously we didn't have any idea what this thing could be, and my brain told me that it wasn't a dog or anything else normal. We basically sprinted the whole way home without incident, and we sat talking about what it could have been. We eventually also told our friends about what had happened that night, but no one had any answers for us, so we just kind of left it alone after that, figuring maybe we were just exaggerating what we saw due to being out in the cold in the dark. But then, a few nights later, it was unusually warm, so my wife and I decided to go out on our back porch swing, where we sat overlooking the yard while drinking some hot chocolate before going to bed. It's a covered, screened-in porch back there. It was probably close to 10 p.m. when we sat down on the swing, when all of a sudden something ran through our backyard, making lots of noise, crashing through the brush and trees that run along behind our house. The thing is, there are no houses behind us, so whatever this thing was, it must have been coming from the woods across our street, which is a decent distance away. I got up to go look out the screen door on the porch that leads to the yard, and when I did, my wife yelled that she just saw something pass through our yard light. I had noticed the flicker of the light too, because whatever it was so big it blocked out most of the light as it passed by. She described what she saw as being like a huge, hairy man walking upright on 2 legs, but with very long arms swinging at its side while it moved through our yard. I followed my eyes to where she was pointing, but didn't see anything because it was too dark outside. but I could definitely hear whatever it was crashing through brush and trees as it moved away from us. We looked at each other, locked the screen door, which we don't always do, and headed up to bed while checking that all the doors and windows were locked. The next day, we found tracks in some soft dirt near where all this had happened, and they were definitely not human footprints, although they resembled them somewhat except for one thing. There were no distinct toes, only long, sharp-looking imprints. I eventually showed these tracks to some of my friends who lived in the area, and they told me that they didn't know what this could be, but it sure wasn't anything they had ever seen before, and that we needed to be super careful for sure. My wife and I quickly made the decision to just stay inside our house after dark from then on, or at least only on the porch with the screen door locked, as we really didn't know what might be out there roaming around. After these two sightings or experiences, or whatever you want to call them, we never really heard or saw anything else after that. But I did notice some years later when we were moving away from that house that a lot of the local farmers had started using dogs to guard their livestock at night. I also noticed that around this same time, people in our old neighborhood began putting up fences and cameras all over their yards. To me, it looked like they were trying to keep something out. Whatever it was, it may be the thing we saw. I really wonder if it is still out there, because since moving away from there, I haven't heard any other concrete reports coming from anywhere near that part of Ohio. Maybe someone else has seen something similar since then, though. If you do know of anything like this, please let me know so I can get more details on the updates of that area. Thank you.